Welcome everyone. If you're just joining us, feel free to put in the chat who you are, where you are, what organization you're from. All right, we are going to get started in 1 minute. Welcome. We're really glad to have all of you here today. So welcome everyone to PMPI's very first Researcher Showcase. Today we are featuring Emily Labandera of Excellencia in Education. My name is Mary Ellen McGuire and I'm the president of PMPI. And I'm joined today by McGregor Obergfell, who is our Associate Director of Research and Congressional Education. The goal of this and all of our researcher showcases is to introduce you to newer policy researchers and their work. After I introduce Emily today, she's going to provide a brief overview of the findings of her recent work focused on how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected Latino and Black students' enrollment and retention. When she's finished, I have a quick question for her, and then we'll go straight into audience Q&A. We're going to use the Q&A feature today. Feel free to start putting in questions at any point in time. When we get to the Q&A time, after our initial presentation here, McGregor will call out your questions for you. Before I introduce Emily, I do want to remind everyone that today's session is recorded and we will use it later to post on social media and our website. So Emily, welcome. For those of you who don't know her already, Emily is a research analyst at Excellencia in Education. She focuses on issues relevant to Latinos in higher education in collaboration with the policy and research team at Excellencia. Her path in education policy was sparked by her personal experience as a first-generation and STEM undergraduate student. Her research interests include HSIs, college affordability, and educational pathways. So Emily, what can you tell us today about Latino and Black students' enrollment and retention in the wake of the pandemic?
Thank you so much, Mary Ellen and McGregor and all the folks at PMPI, and also to all of you listening in and joining us today in this conversation, a very important one at that. So I do want to start diving right into the data, and we'll be seeing data from the National Student Clearinghouse. And so during this last year and a half, we've seen that undergraduate student enrollment has declined nationally. Looking at specifically from fall 2019 to fall 2020. And Latino and Black students' enrollment and their retention has been disproportionately impacted. So from this first graphic, you'll see those changes, those percent changes in enrollment for all students, as well as broken out by race ethnicity. And particularly for your specific attention, I want you to see how Latino students, for example, were making gains in enrollment prior to the pandemic, and how that has impacted them negatively, as well as Black students, how their enrollment has further declined as a result of the pandemic. It's important to think about how Latino and Black students fit into a post-traditional student profile, which can include students that are working while they're enrolled. Perhaps they enroll at community colleges. They might be first generation. They might also be older students, and they also might have dependents or children of their own that they're taking care of while they are enrolled. And these students tend to make college choices based on accessibility, on their location, as well as affordability. When we look at how the pandemic has impacted disproportionately low-wage workers, for example, which are generally people of color, how these folks have loss of income, loss of jobs, loss of employment, taking care of dependents, as well as compounded by issues of college affordability, this could explain some of these sharp enrollment declines for Latino and Black students. Naturally, and you'll see on the next slide, these declines in enrollment manifest themselves in retention rates, which is what our focus will be on today as well. Latino and Black students have had lower retention rates compared to their peers when you look at all students in the US, as well as their Asian and white peers. And I want to note that these retention rates are the percentage of first-time first-year students that return to the same institution they enrolled at the following term for their second year. And it's important to note that. And on the last slide, you'll also see when looking at sector, that Latino and Black students had the lowest retention rates at community colleges. If you see at the four-year level between public and privates, there's not a lot of variance there, but the disproportionate effect has been felt in their retention rates at community colleges, which is important to note as well. Understanding these data, enrollment and retention, is important because these are indicators of students' pathways on their way to a college degree. It's important for institutions to identify ways that they can improve their efforts to better serve these students and their retention. And also to note that these racial and ethnic disparities and systemic inequities have continued and persisted, even frankly before the pandemic, and they've just been exacerbated and further highlighted during this time. So I know I just shared a lot of data and numbers, but I'm happy to stop there and answer any more questions. Thank you.
Mary Ellen, you're muted.
Thank you. Emily, I have one question that I wanted to ask you before we go into the Q&A. A little more detail on how might the federal policy support Latino and Black students' enrollment and retention as they move towards completion of their degree?
Sure, and thank you for that question. Absolutely, federal policy and frankly, policy at all levels are critical. As I mentioned earlier, it's critical in closing these equity gaps and making sure we end these systemic inequities that have existed prior to the pandemic. The pandemic has just enforced these challenges and exacerbated them, particularly for Latino and Black students and students of color. So from Excelencia's policy agenda, I want to note that there are several recommendations for federal policy, but I'll highlight a few that I think are important for our discussion. And I'll start with, federal policy can better capture, for example, Latino and Black students' pathways in college and how funding can impact these student groups. And so improving data tracking, data collection, and data sharing to improve strategies for better serving these students. So that could be one way. Another way is to provide financial incentives for students. So I think of, we can talk about doubling Pell, for example, and ensuring that a larger share of a student's cost of attendance could be potentially covered by increasing the maximum Pell Grant and helping to retain these students year to year on their path towards a degree. Another key way that federal policy can have a critical impact is prioritizing and significantly providing financial support to the institutions that serve these students. So you can think about HSIs, HBCUs, community colleges, and also institutions that may not have those designations, but that truly have impactful programs, strategies, thoughtful leadership, and show evidence of effectiveness in their serving these student groups. It's important that institutions are better supported, especially those that are intentionally serving these students, which are, it's important to end these equity gaps that we're seeing.
Thank you, Emily. McGregor, I'm going to pass this over to you for Q&A now. I see we have some questions coming in.
Yes, thank you, Mary Ellen, and thank you, Emily, for that overview. We have a couple of great questions, and I encourage all of our attendees to keep submitting those via the Q&A feature. We'll get to as many as we can. Emily, first question that we have is from Mary Ann. Do you have an explanation for lower retention rates at community colleges?
Sure, and thank you so much for that question. I want to note that community colleges serve these student groups so well, and that Latino and Black students make college choices based on what's most accessible and most affordable for them. They're making these choices trying to work a system that frankly hasn't always served them best. And so possibly an explanation for the retention rates at community colleges is that these students are making choices in terms of, do I seek work instead of further enrolling or continuing? Do I stop out and take care of my children or my dependents, parents? It has a lot to do with the profile of these students and the choices that they make based on affordability, family, and other issues.
Great, thank you. I have another question in my queue for you. What do we see about part-time Latino students? Have more Latino students switched to part-time during the pandemic and thus stayed enrolled? Do you have any data around part-time enrollment?
That's a great question. Off the top of my head, I know these Clearinghouse data, we're looking at, the level of student enrollment and retention. So if it was undergraduate or graduate, I have a feeling, and I can say that more often than not, students will probably enroll part-time. And just in terms of specifically the question with Latino students tend to mix their enrollment even before the pandemic exacerbated these college affordability and accessibility issues. So Latino students in particular may enroll part-time one semester and then full-time and continue mixing that enrollment, trying to make it work for them and their families and their work schedules. So hopefully that answers the question. And I'm not happy to follow up and see if we can further disaggregate the data by enrollment intensity as well.
Great, thank you, Emily. I want to do a last call for questions from our audience. If you have any, please feel free to get those in within the next, and we did have one come in, so I'll ask that now. So Emily, are there any promising practices that institutions have used to retain Latino students during the pandemic?
That's a great question. So I actually want to highlight Excelencia's work with the Growing What Works database, as well as our examples of Excelencia effort. It's the only national data-driven effort that highlights programs and practices that truly serve Latino students specifically with their evidence of effectiveness. And we've seen from our work and the work of others that what truly serves Latino students will serve all students, because of the profile that they embody, all of those different factors of being employed while they're enrolled, taking care of dependents, their enrollment intensity, affordability issues, all of that. So I encourage you all to take a look at our Growing What Works database for so many of these programs that are doing such intentional work for their students, and to keep an eye out. I'll put a personal plug in for Excelencia here, to keep an eye out for the end of October, I believe it's October 28th, when we're having our Celebración of Excelencia, where we highlight programs at different levels, associate, baccalaureate, graduate, and also community-based organizations that are doing these great work and strategizing. And I think of, mentorship, providing more assistance, more emergency aid, a lot of holistic services provided for Latino students, because we see that it's not just about enrolling students, it's not just about access to education, it's making sure that the student is holistically served so that they can be retained as well as make their way towards graduation and earning a degree.
Great, thank you, Emily. And I will be sure to include a link to that upcoming event on the October 28th to all of our attendees logged in today, in a follow-up email after the session. I did want to quickly just go back and thank Ira for her question on part-time enrollment, and that last question was from Jeanette. So thank you both of you for asking those questions. Our last question of the day is from an anonymous attendee. And the question is, do we have data broken down by institution type, i.e. public institutions, private institutions, and for-profit institutions? Have more students enrolled in for-profit colleges since the pandemic started?
Awesome, great, a two-part question, a great question. We definitely have data broken down by sectors in terms of enrollment. I know in the slides I focused on public and private nonprofit 4 years and the public 2 years. We have seen in the pandemic, it's the community colleges that have been disproportionately impacted in terms of student enrollment and retention. While all institutions, all undergraduate and graduate students have been affected during this time, we're definitely feeling these effects all across. The 4 years have been able to kind of hold on to the students that they've enrolled and retained. It's at the public 2 year level that we're seeing more of an impact. So happy to share more data on enrollment, especially by sector.
Thanks, Emily. I have a related question kind of building off that. This one is also from an anonymous attendee. Do you know if retention rates differ by region? given the global pandemic and lack of internet or technology access in some regions of the United States, do you think that those pieces influenced retention rates throughout the pandemic?
Absolutely. We definitely are seeing how by region, and I'm led to think about more rural areas with less broadband infrastructure and less, just technology and accessibility to Wi-Fi networks. We've definitely heard from institutions during this time, community colleges and at the four-year level as well, that, when March of 2020 happened and that quick pivot to online virtual learning, remote, like staying at home, all of those factors, a lot of these institutions quickly, made it happen in terms of broadening their Wi-Fi networks across campuses so students and their families could, drive into a parking lot and sit on their computer and try to do some of their work. And we've definitely seen institutions just providing things like laptops, iPads, tablets, all of that to their students. So definitely we have seen those impacts by region and areas that are, not as connected to broadband infrastructure.
Great. Well, thank you. That was a very thorough response to all of our great questions from our audience. I appreciate everyone submitting questions, and I apologize to those of you who submitted those questions that we weren't able to get to. My apologies for that. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Ellen for a quick close and a final thought from Emily.
Hey, Emily, I'm actually going to start with your final thought before I close here. So what more would you like us to know? What did we miss today? 1 minute, final word, final thought. What would you like to amplify before you leave?
Sure. Thank you so much for that. I just want to emphasize that, Latino and Black students, first-gen students, students from low-income backgrounds, they're already doing so much and putting so much effort and making college choices that fit their cultural and needs and their families' needs. And so it's important for policy at all levels, for institutions across the country, and for all of us, our communities, to understand that these equity gaps and disparities have existed prior to the pandemic. The pandemic has just served to highlight them further and has further exacerbated them. So it's important for policy especially to really support the institutions and the students themselves. It's support those that are supporting students. I think that is the greatest emphasis that we can have, because there's truly so much great work being done, such intentional. We're at Excelencia, we're big on the intentionality and the better serving Latino students and all students during this time. And frankly, when we enter a period of recovery and onward, whatever that may look like.
Thank you, Emily. Well, thank you again, everyone, for coming to our first researcher showcase. After we close today, you're going to receive an email from us. It'll have a link to Emily's work and a survey where you can tell us what you learned today and what you thought about the format. I also wanted to mention that next week, we'll be putting out another call for researchers and research. I would greatly encourage all of you to look for that email and nominate yourself or someone else for us to feature. And Emily, again, thank you. And thank you for all the work that you do at Excelencia. I hope you all have a great day, and we hope to see everyone soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.